even most Biden voters don't see a thriving economy. A recent New York Times Siena poll of voters in 6 battleground states, and this is really the most relevant stuff too, right, is 62% of Biden voters think the economy is only fair or poor, compared with 97% of those who voted for Donald Trump. That's
and there are 4 basically indicators on that scale there: excellent and good, or poor and only fair. And the generational differences here are striking, in my opinion. The 89% of folks in those Biden supporters in those swing states who are 18 to 29 believe that the economy is poor, either poor or only fair. And in the 30 to 44 age cohort, that's 80% there. And you can draw some conclusions based on that, or at least a correlation, which is that the supporters 29 and under, I would say those are largely the folks who are being gouged by landlords and who have to pay a ton in rent. And the 30 to 44 cohort are often people who are either also being gouged by rent, but maybe are trying to save for a home, and they're seeing how high housing prices are and how the Biden administration has ticked up the interest rates in an effort to combat inflation during his presidency, like 10 times at this point? It's more expensive to get a mortgage right now than it has been in decades.
Well, I mean, to be clear, the Fed is theoretically independent, so it's not necessarily the Biden administration has done but that is that is what's happened. Interest rate has gone essentially on a mortgage, anyways, from high 2s, mid 3s to mid 6s to mid 7s, and the difference on that in terms of your buying power. 2 things happen. One is that to afford, even if prices of houses stay the same house costs $250,000 or $300,000 as it did 3 years ago, the cost of carrying, let's say it's a $300,000 house, and you've got to put down 10%. The cost of carrying that $270,000 mortgage, where at an interest rate of, let's say, 3%, is somewhere around, just back of the envelope, $1,100, is now going to cost you $2,200 a month, maybe $2,300, $2,400 a month. And what that does is, it prevents people from buying their first homes, and it increases the pressure on the rental markets, raises the rents there, and B, it also keeps people locked in and have no choice but to stay where they are. So maybe you wanted to move because you've had another kid and you want to get a bigger house. You can't, because the 3.5% you're paying to buy the same house is going to cost you double, because you don't get that. You don't get to carry that mortgage over. So if I'm in a $300,000 house and I'm paying $1,100 a month in mortgage, I'm not going to go get a $500,000 house, because the mortgage is going to triple.
And that explains those generational differences there, where it's not like, if this was just due to inflation and prices still remaining high, that would, in theory, I would say, at least decrease some of these stark differences, because of course, the more money, the older you have, and you're supposed to have more savings, etc. But prices would, at least, if that was the driving factor, mitigate those stark differences to some degree. But that's clearly not the case here, right? So 45 to 64 and 65 and older, they're much more likely to already have a home and have paid off a good amount of it, not be as subject to this. And
all you need to do is, the sort of there's 2 things going on here. You have the economic numbers that are showing the GDP is growing at a good rate, that wages are up, to a certain extent, even over inflation, although some of these prices are locked in. And again, housing is such a key component, because it not only impacts your costs, but your flexibility. And this is, I think you also look at like how much wealth
That's it.
people at age 30 have now, as opposed to what they
That's
would
what
have
the
had
economy's good for.
20 or 30 years ago. It's boomers had more money at any given age than Gen Xers, that had any more money than millennials, that had more money than Gen Z at the same age. When you compare apples to apples,
controlling for inflation, controlling for all of those things.
It's in terms of who's controlling the amount of wealth in the country.
It's property relations, like these sorts of things. Like because we don't ask, we only ask by income. So it's under 50K, 500. But we don't ask like how much property you have. Are you a rentier? Are you a business owner? Or are you a worker? But age is a good proxy for that. So I'd imagine most 65-year-olds are on the rent.
It used to be. I mean, I'm saying that a 30-year-old in the year 2000 had more, 30-year-old cohort had more of the wealth,
right? Yeah, of course,
than a 30-year-old today,
right?
And so, what we're dealing with is like, at one point you hit a critical mass where people are like, this sucks, and on top of which, the boomers are like, when I was your age, I wasn't whining about this as much.
Well, speaking of boomers, Washington Post, November 13th, baby boomers are buying up all the houses this year. Median age for a repeat buyer was 58, according. Yeah, it must be nice. I'd probably think the economy was pretty good.
And the reason why that is the case is because if you're at that age and you've owned your house for 25 years, you have a lot more equity in it.
Oh, totally.
So when you turn around, the interest rate doesn't influence you as much because you're going to have to borrow, if anything, less. And you can afford to put down 50, 60, 70%, 80% in your house.
What did those folks also pay for college as well? And how much did they have in student loans? Like the perception of the economy for people 44 and under, that's going to affect that a ton, and also by income. And I should also just say, like, Osita, Nuevo, who's been a guest on this program before, had a tweet just basically saying, how Biden could get his numbers up, maybe, is like actually start running on something and have some initiative and tell people what he wants to do.
That's all he needs to be.
Yeah, what he wants to do if he gets reelected. And my suggestion would be a national housing initiative. Whatever he wants. I'm sure it would be in some form of vouchers. I'm sure that, it would not be exactly what I wanted, but we could have a beginning of the conversation of repealing the Faircloth Amendment, where we build more affordable housing for people and hopefully drive down some of these prices. Like, I don't know, they can workshop it, but that would be something that maybe young people would be incentivized to come to the polls for you for, because got to be honest, there's a lot of folks who are pretty angry right now about not just the economy, but of course the administration's enabling of Israel's mass killing in Gaza.
You have Brian Beutler and people like Biden defenders putting this all on TikTok. Like, these splits are because of social media and stuff like that. There is a delusion about the state of the economy. We've been hearing for so long. Like, actually, the economy is good compared to the G7. Well, how about compared if I need to go get an apartment?
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing, is that, I mean, but I do think, I mean, look, there is no doubt that coverage shapes the way that people have a perspective on this. And there's also no doubt in my mind that COVID also influenced like people's expectations and understanding of how they're situated. What may be on paper a good economy today versus what may have been a good economy on paper in 2019 doesn't necessarily look as good after you've been through a situation like COVID, where you may have reevaluated your priorities.
Yeah.
And
also 2019 looked good compared to like 2008. Like we were basically like coming out of a trough to begin with.
I mean, this is interesting though from the Times. And again, this is just like an anecdote that I think is, they include to sort of balance this stuff out. But there was a couple, Mackenzie Kaiser 20 and Lawson Millwood 21. University students, University of North Georgia, managed to buy a house this year. Millwood's income as an information technology systems administrator at the university was enough to qualify. they only worsen if they waited because of rising interest rates. Still, the experience left a bitter taste. The housing market is absolutely insane. We pay for the same for our one-story, one-bedroom cinder block 1950s houses my mom paid for her three-story, four-bedroom house less than a decade ago. I mean, that's a pretty stark. Miss Kaiser doesn't think Biden's done much to help the economy, but Trump isn't more appealing on that front. They think both of them are too old. But what's interesting is this at the end. Mr. Millwood, Mrs. Kaiser's partner, said that he was concerned that society had grown more unequal in recent years, but didn't see Biden doing much about it. From what I see, it really doesn't look like the working class is benefiting from things recently, said Mr. Millwood, who supports a higher federal minimum wage and is impatient with the bickering and finger-pointing he hears about it in Washington. After the phone conversation ended, I guess apparently this is how they interviewed him, Mr. Millwood texted to say that upon reflection, he would also like to see Biden push to lower taxes for low-income families and make it more difficult for the wealthiest to dodge them. After being sent news articles about Biden's support for the extension of the now expired child tax credit and the appropriation of $80 billion for the Internal Revenue Service in part to pursue tax evaders, he seemed surprised. That is absolutely what I had in mind, Mr. Millwood texted. It's been so noisy in the media lately, I haven't seen much that is covering things like that, adding, Biden doesn't seem so bad after all, haha. I mean, so there's a lot of different things at play here. But the bottom line is, I mentioned that PCCC polling that they had written about last week, or I guess maybe a week and a half ago in Politico. The people don't see Biden as any more protective of Social Security than Donald Trump. And this is a failure of messaging. I mean, it's simply the case. And again, Grover Norquist said it best about Donald Trump. We just need a body with someone who can sign stuff. And Donald Trump could say now he's not going to cut Social Security and Medicare, but there was a plan to cut Medicare that was on the table. You can be assured when he is talking about going after the ACA, you know what they're talking about. They're talking about Medicaid. They want to roll back Medicaid. And the Democratic Party has voted to expand Social Security, at least in the Senate, non-binding resolution, but it gives you a sense of where the party stands. And apparently the Biden administration still, or the campaign, still reluctant to sort of make this more of an issue.
It's the same way that in the run-up to Build Back Better, all of a sudden they're doing photo ops with Manchin and all the centrist people. And
Totally.
like, actually, we're going to do this.
Totally. I mean, I think like it certainly makes sense to assume that people are going to want to vote against Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. But it's not like 2020 was a runaway election. You're talking literally 40 or 50,000 votes over the course of 3 or 4 states, in Georgia and Arizona. And
that was also the result of the highest turnout election we've seen in the history of the country, right? The most votes ever for Trump talks about it all the time.
Both the loser and the winner.
Yeah, yep. For both the loser and the winner. So like, if some percentage of those folks stay home, that's a huge problem for Biden.
So we should start hectoring them.
Yeah, it just seems like the primary saving grace for Biden world, who's like still confident in Biden, is just that people are going to get to their polling place, go into the ballot box, and say, "Oh, I met with a binary choice, and I must choose one."
Maybe and to a certain extent that's going to happen, but is it going to be enough?
Is it going to? That's the question,
Right.
right? Is it going to be enough to just say, "Oh, I don't have any other choice that's meaningful. Let's just go with Biden because I don't like Trump, and I hate Trump more,
Yeah.
or I don't like."
well, I mean, look, negative partisanship has a lot to do with it, but we're talking now margins.
Yeah.
We're talking like where do you get this extra 1 or 2% of the vote in any given place? Buckets of buckets, asked Sam. It's 11 months out from the election. Why would Biden be spending money to run ads now? He wouldn't. I mean, maybe in some limited instances that makes some sense. But no, you wouldn't. But what you would do is, I mean, how many ads did you see about junk fees? None. They made a little bit of push. It got subsumed by other stuff that was happening around. This is what professional politicians and political people do. How do we go out and change the nature of the conversation so that this draws attention to it? You had, for instance, a conviction of egg manufacturers or producers who were accused of price fixing and found guilty of price fixing from 2004 to 2008. We recently just had a huge run up in egg prices, largely because of the avian flu, because a lot of chickens were killed. But an aggressive political party would start having hearings in the House that they control, in the Senate, on egg prices so that you could communicate this notion of maybe there was some price gouging that was going on in terms of inflation, and we're doing something about it. We're starting to engage in antitrust. Maybe an aggressive political party encouraged by the president, even if it wasn't necessarily publicly, would say to Dick Durbin, hey, you know that idea you had 6 weeks ago about subpoenaing Harlan Crow, who paid for the house of a mother of a Supreme Court justice and paid for the schooling, the private schooling of a Supreme Court justice, same Supreme Court justice's kid or adopted son or, foster child, and paid for trips? Maybe this is a good way to point to the corruption of the Supreme Court, because there was a very big thing that happened under the Supreme Court that implicates Democratic voters.
As Hunter Biden volunteers to testify in the hearings in the House, like, the Democrats in the Senate should be thinking, how are we, they think they're above it, but how can we actually...
They're afraid.
Well, they're afraid. I mean, just even the Biden administration, and their messaging on Build Back Better, right? Or what ended up being the Inflation Reduction Act. There's been multiple articles about how people are just completely unaware of what was even in that piece of legislation, and they're unaware of those tax credits for electric vehicles. They're unaware of all of these provisions, and that's a failure of what the White House has felt they're too, above and too involved in the minutia of civil service and not engaging in politics to engage in.
I don't know if it's they feel they're too above or they're afraid or whatever it is, but whatever it is, there's a failure of actually aggressively doing something. And they think that they can just wait and let Donald Trump hang himself. And, it may work.
Got him in
but
the
it
office.
may not.
I mean, yesterday Biden had a whole press conference about discouraging price gouging.
Yeah.
And touting the supply chain kind of returning to form. And it was like a press conference that had sort of mealy mouth language about what the purpose of it was, and the big log line from it was basically Biden saying, "Hey, corporations, no more of that. No more price gouging now that inflation is lowering." I mean, you have to, if you can't actually have teeth assigned to some of these things that you're saying, you have to at least pretend like there is some teeth to it.
Yeah.
Or at least have the mobilization or mechanization that you have in the Senate, as you said, Sam, to even make some sort of hay out of that.
I think it's just because when the Republicans do the reverse, or they go after whatever big tech or corporations, there's an understanding that it's all theatrical. But if you were actually the target from the Democratic side, the price gouging, that's a little bit meatier for their donors too.
Zane Iams, what is the plan for the Never Biden folks? I get he's not the ideal candidate, but I don't see anyone putting in the work to attempt to replace him or get a new grassroots movement going. Didn't we just play this dumbass game of chicken in 2016? I mean, look, there's one person who is going to decide whether Joe Biden is going to be the nominee at this point. It's Joe Biden. And it seems like the window for him, who knows what's going on in his head, to rationalize getting out of the race is probably passed. Maybe it hasn't. I mean, it's obviously a different equation if he can't be the nominee. But yeah, I agree with you. There is no one. I mean, no one is stepping up in the Democratic Party to challenge him except for Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson, because they all feel like they're viable in 2028. regardless of what happens this time around. And they're all very ambitious politicians. Obviously, it'd be a different situation, if something happens to him. But, we can sit here and think that by saying we think Biden's too old, that somehow this is going to be butterfly wings and it's going to convince Joe Biden that he's too old. I can tell you, as someone who is aging, you never think you're too old. If you thought that you could do it in the first place, let's put it that way. And so I don't think that's going to influence. All you're doing is you're creating this, you're just adding to this, this bubble. I mean, if
I don't see a lot of never Biden. I think people are like, hey, can you stop Israel from doing an ethnic cleansing, please? Because I voted for you last time.
I mean, there were people who were saying this, beforehand in terms of he's too old, he's not going to win, and I'm going to run to make that point.
Right, that was silly.
Maryland Socialist, when a Biden voter in 2020 says they won't vote for Biden in 2024, what they really mean is they won't bother voting in 2024. Getting these people out to vote is going to be more difficult than getting them to vote for Biden. I think that's true. Chicago Steve, even if the Democrats were better about messaging, how would anyone hear the message? We're all lunatics who actively follow politics. There's just no mechanism right now for getting the message to the more passive news consumer. Well,
I don't know about that.
I think there's some truth to that. But understand, you need to get to people who are somewhere between us and those more passive news consumers, because in 3 or 4 months or 6 months, when people start engaging more, those are the people that those other people turn to. So it's not necessarily you're going to be able to tomorrow flick a switch. It's like you're building a foundation. Hey, buddy, we see you. On egg price inflation, studies have shown the market was actually tampered with, and Big Egg ran away with the profits. Avian flu was not as big of an influence as first thought. I don't know. I haven't seen those studies. It could very well be the case. My point is, you have hearings to both pursue the that question as just to find out and fix it, but also to get that question into the body politic, so that people have a consciousness that, wait a second, maybe we shouldn't have just accepted this on face value, and you influence things like, people at the Fed and whatnot.